9:30 a.m. session, Cloud 101, taking GIS to the cloud. Welcome to the last day of the GIS conference. Appreciate you guys being here. This morning, we have Wendy Poloquin and Steve Mulberry from GIS Inc., both very experienced in GIS and the cloud. So we've got a full presentation here. So from here on out, I'm going to let Steve Mulberry take it away.
All right, thank you, and thank you all for joining this morning. I'm actually presenting from my home in Boise, Idaho, so it's a little chilly out here this morning. But Wendy and I want to share some ideas and strategies on taking ArcGIS to the cloud. I know this past year, 2020, was unique to say the least, and we've at GIS Inc. have seen an increase in organizations looking to adopt the cloud for providing additional services needed to support things like remote workforce or providing access to your enterprise web GIS. We've seen lots of challenges, maybe when to use the cloud, or which provider is best for your organization, or maybe how to make that transition, and what's the best strategy for migrating to the cloud. And we understand that those questions could be maybe a little frustrating to answer or a little overwhelming, but we believe the cloud offers incredible benefits to organizations. So that's our goal here today, is kind of walk you through some of those benefits and ideas and things to think about as you move to the cloud. So I want to start off with a couple of slides that show some stats. So bear with me here just for a few seconds, because I think it's important to kind of set the stage. Now, when I started at GIS Inc. back in 2009, coming from Esri, I helped deploy our first cloud solution in Amazon Web Services for a health organization. And you can see over the years, and we're kind of being pretty transparent here, you can see over the years where we have helped organizations, either state and local government, commercial, airports, move to the cloud. And you can see that big uptake 2019, 2020 for sure. And in 2021, just in the short few months of this year, we're seeing a lot of interest, a lot of discussions, a lot of folks wanting to start that migration or start looking at ways to leverage the cloud, either full on, taking everything to the cloud, or some kind of hybrid approach there. Which is interesting, because if you look at the industry standards out there, this is a report done by RightScale, comparing the public adoption of the cloud from 2018 and 2019. And you can see the big three there: Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and others that are also in the arena of providing cloud services. But the big three there, you can see that percentage of folks moving to the cloud. And what's interesting, if you compare that to the year previous, 2016 to 2017, you can still see that same growth pattern, right? People are moving to the cloud. But what's really interesting is that as more and more folks move to the cloud and more cloud providers come on the scene, that's better for us, because that drives the cost down. It makes it cost competitive to use these services and take advantage of the cloud. So just a couple more quick graphs here. So this is 2020. This is what the cloud adoption for the enterprise looks like in 2020. You can see those that are currently using it. Again, another increase already showing there, those that are experimenting, those that are planning to use it. So again, a lot of folks that are looking at ways to leverage and use the cloud. Now, what's interesting in this RightScale report, and there's just one more chart I want to show you, is that there are some challenges, and folks are seeing those challenges across the board, whether it's managing the cloud costs, from governance to security to compliance, all the way down to cloud migration. So these are the challenges folks are having moving to the cloud. And I think it's interesting because that top one there, managing cloud expenditures, because it's sort of so easy just to spin up services that sometimes you forget, and you spin a lot of services up, and you're paying for what you use when you use it. And so when it's spun up, you're paying for every hour. So there's some tricks there to help manage the costs of the cloud, so that you only pay for what you use when you use it, and you only turn it on when you need it. So let's kind of jump in here. And I think the best way to kind of talk through this is to break it down to sort of four categories, right? What does the cloud do for me? And I think over the years, the expectations of what the cloud can do has grown exponentially. And I want to start off by talking about the capabilities. So this gives us the ability to move away from and replace those legacy systems, take advantage of of service offerings like load balancing and serverless computing, or the buzzword of elasticity, right? Growing in storage and services and computing power and those kinds of things. So the capabilities of getting us out of our traditional data centers into these environments that allow us to scale up and scale down very quickly. There's also the performance. So the cloud offers us this optimized environment, and that we can build these infrastructures that can scale up, scale down as needed. A lot of reliability and redundancy are built into the core service offerings that cloud providers have for us. So we can kind of rethink how we engage in high availability, right, or disaster recovery, things like that, because there's a lot of that redundancy built into some of these services, especially those serverless computing or database service offerings and things like that. Cost is a big one here. You can trade off the capital expenditures for variable costs or variable expenses, right? Avoiding that need to have hardware refresh rates every 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And all cloud providers offer this economy of scale. So you pay for what you use for when you use it, but the more you use, the less you pay, which is really an interesting concept there. And then security. And I guess one note back on cost, but you got to be careful, because the more you turn on, right, the more hourly cost that you're going to incur there. So security and compliance. The cloud providers have to maintain very high physical security. But what's interesting here is that it's imperative that we understand that there is a shared security model where the cloud providers are responsible for security in the cloud, and we as users are responsible for security of the cloud, meaning that we've got to pay attention to what ports we open, our firewall settings, our users, how we give access to those users. And we'll talk more about that in a second there. But these four main categories help kind of explain why the cloud is there, what it offers, and how we can take advantage of that. So when should you use the cloud? What are some of the things you should be thinking about as you look to migrate the cloud? Maybe your organization is starting to think cloud first. Maybe in your planning sessions, you're starting to look at ways to leverage the cloud. Or maybe you've heard the cloud is everything I just talked about, right? It's cheap, it's secure, it's elastic, resilient, it's simple to use, and blah, 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 blah. Right? Maybe some of those things are interesting to you. Or maybe you have large amounts of information and data that you need to process, but don't have the on-premise resources to do that. Maybe it's lots of imagery or IoT or LiDAR data. Maybe you want to do some integration with those third-party business systems or those cloud-based business environments like IoT or AI or machine learning, or those things that it can process large amounts of information and you can scale up and scale down as needed. Or maybe you need to have off-site backup. And this is where a lot of folks just begin their cloud adoption approach just by creating off-site backup of their systems and software and data and things like that. Maybe your IT is reluctant to change, and maybe that's a harsh word, but maybe they're so busy taking care of their day-to-day work that they can't maintain an environment that you need in the GIS world to keep up with software versions or hardware requirements or storage requirements or those things. And maybe the cloud is more interesting in that respect. Or maybe you need to, off that play, need to access that modern hardware and be able to scale the systems and networks as needed. And maybe you just need to pay, you only want to pay for what you use, which is a big compelling reason, right? Sometimes when we have these hardware sitting around, we buy all this hardware, but then we don't use it for a year or two because we're just not there yet. Well, we've had to pay for that and lost out on that opportunity. Well, whereas the cloud, you only stand up what you need when you need it, and so that helps with the cost there. Or maybe your organization has been breached. This is becoming more and more in our face, so to speak. Right, we're seeing a lot of these things happen. We just saw this down in southern Florida, where somebody had hacked into the water supply system there. Maybe there's some other needs, right? That's from a security perspective that you want to look at the cloud. And this is where I want to focus the next couple of slides on, is talking about cloud security. And I first want to introduce sort of 4 features that might help demonstrate why the fear of the cloud is more of a myth in reality when it comes to security. And I'm going to start off with very strong perimeters and surveillance. So these cloud providers have to put in these precautions, things like high fencing, barbed wire fencing, concrete barriers, guards that patrol the area night and day, security cameras, very, very intense security around the perimeters and the surveillance of that environment. Controlling access. So not only do they control access to the employees of these cloud vendor data centers, but either the vendors and the visitors, they're all physically separated from any one company's mission critical data, right? And then not only having access to these best data centers and providing that strong perimeter surveillance and controlled access, but having access to highly skilled IT professional teams that are experts in cybersecurity and are constantly looking at threats that may impact accessing and vulnerability to the system. Which brings me to my last point here, is that each one of these cloud providers go through a rigorous audit frequently, right, to help protect against these flaws in their security system. So they're constantly looking at new threats and new risks that could impact the performance of their environments that you would take advantage of. I've been in this business for a long time, literally for over 30 years. I've been at the state, the local level, the government level, commercial level, and I've been in a lot of data centers, some very secure and some that look just like this. Literally, I've been in one that the front door of the data center was propped open by a fan to help keep it cool. I heard a story once where this one city had the data center was on the first floor and the bathroom was on the second floor. The pipes broke, water came through and wreaked havoc on the whole environment. I just think that these cloud providers can surpass any data center that we can build on premise and maintain that security, the surveillance, the controlled access, the cybersecurity experts, all those things just scream. Cloud security is much more equipped to kind of handle. That's their job, right? They have to provide those environments for those who use the cloud. Also, cloud providers offer these security offerings that are designated, sort of designated regions that are physically separated and architected to meet the U.S. Department of Defense security requirements. Microsoft has one called Azure Government or Government DoD. Amazon has one called GovCloud. There are environments that you can use that are already sort of pre-configured for things like FedRAMP security or FISMA or HIPAA or whatever you require from a security perspective. And so that goes back to that shared security model where the cloud providers are responsible for security in the cloud. So they provide these environments for you. But once you get in there, then you're responsible for the security of the cloud. So the things that you expose, who you give access to, how you give access to, and what devices, from where, those kinds of things. So security in the cloud it's ready, it's primed for us to leverage that, and we shouldn't let that be the factor that keeps us from moving to the cloud. How do you get started? What are some of the tasks or steps that you should take to prepare for when you want to start moving to the cloud? And I have documentation here as number one. And yeah, I say can't get enough, but I don't want you to go overboard with this, right? Don't write theses about how you're going to do this, but you've got to document everything along the way and then share that documentation throughout your organization. The more you get buy-in, the more you get support, the more you share what you're about to do, the easier it is for people to migrate from what they're used to doing on-premise to the cloud environment. Evaluate what you're trying to achieve. Talk to the experts, right? Architect out that environment that's going to best fit your needs across the board. If you need production and a staging and a testing, and you need high availability, or you need a backup and disaster recovery, there's all kinds of things to think about when moving your on-premise to the cloud, or even just starting off for that matter. And as you go through this process, educate, right? Share the dream, as I mentioned before. Take the documentation, take the things you're learning and share that out. Let other folks understand what they're doing. It's easier to make that switch when you're brought along the path, that migration path, instead of just at the very last minute saying, hey, now you're going to switch, now you're going to move to this new platform, a new environment. It could get a little dicey there. And then deployment. look at and deploy using best deployment patterns and best practices for those deployment patterns. Esri releases a lot of documentation on this. We've got years and years of experience of deploying, and so picking out that right deployment pattern. Maybe you don't need all three environments, production stage and testing and development, right? You can have sort of this hybrid approach there. And then pick the right migration strategy. There's a lot of buzzwords out there for things like rehosting or refactoring or re-architecting or rebuilding, starting from scratch kind of concept. And these words sort of holistically talk about the entire migration, right? Moving the systems and the software. But what I think the biggest risk when moving to the cloud that people sort of overlook sometimes, and there's two of these things I'm going to talk about, is migrating content to the cloud. It's easy to take ArcGIS Enterprise and put it in the cloud. Anybody can do that. But finding that right methodology for taking what years of work that you've done on premise, your databases, your images, your applications, your solutions, your content, your services, all that stuff, and moving that to the cloud, that takes some extra thought and processes, right? And some things to kind of think about here are looking at those deployment environments. Do I need to bring everything over? Do I have content in all these environments? What needs to be brought over? What doesn't need to be brought over? How am I handling authentication? And how is that going to play in the new space in cloud? What databases do I have? And how am I using them? Can I back up and restore? Do I have to have a synchronization process in place? Do I have any automation scripts for data processing that are going to need to be moved to the cloud as well? Because it doesn't stop just because I move to the cloud. Something magically doesn't happen, that the data that we're aggregating or engineering or getting from other business systems, I still have to have that in play there. And then projects, right? And this goes back to the desktop. Where does the desktop editor sit? And this should be highlighted in big, bold orange right here, because again, this is one of those areas where people tend to forget. Where do my desktop editors go? Where do I put ArcMap? Where do I put ArcGIS Pro? And how do those two environments now communicate back and forth from each other? What about all my hosted services, map services, GeoVent, image services, whatever you might have out there, all my web maps and applications, and then any other business systems that I may talk to or may break if I move it from on-premise to the cloud? How's that going to impact this process? Maybe you have like a CityWorks or other third-party asset management or permitting or other systems out there that require access to the GIS data in order to function. Right? Some of these work really well against REST services, and the migration is not going to impact them a lot. But some of them talk directly to the database, which could be a big problem. So think about these things as you start to begin that process to moving to the cloud. Now, I want to give you sort of a quick look at what a sort of basic cloud deployment would look like using the base components of ArcGIS Enterprise, the web adapter, portal, server, and the data store. And if you look at this real quick, I want to just highlight a few things here. There's like 3 or 4 levels of security that we talked about earlier. First, and this is sort of an example of Amazon Web Services, but Azure and Google will have the same sort of naming conventions and things like that. But you pick a region that best fits your organization. Then you create this virtual private cloud. And inside that cloud, you create public and private subnets where you'll place certain components of the enterprise. You'll configure the gateway to only let secure access through port 443 over, or RDP access if you want to manage these environments. Sometimes we put this network address translator in front to help, again, provide another level of security so I can track and monitor what IP addresses are coming in and where they should go. And then put the web adapter and that remote desktop gateway up front in that public subnet, and then secure everything else behind in a private. So that's where portal and ArcGIS server, data store, your other server roles like GeoVent, desktop would sit back there, those kinds of things. And this is what we call an active production environment. And this is right now showing an availability zone A inside the US East region. And to build on top of this, to provide maybe a high availability or a fault tolerant or a disaster recovery, with your Esri licensing, you can create a passive production environment in another availability zone waiting there to pick up in case the production goes down. And you don't incur any more licensing. And that entire platform below is now turned off, right? So you're not paying for it. until you need it. So maybe you're doing some maintenance in the production environment. You put a load balancer up front there. All you have to do is switch that load balancer to your passive production environment, turn that on, and now you can move things around. You can do some updates and manage and software and patches and security patches and things like that. This is a very common pattern that folks use when they're doing basic ArcGIS enterprise deployments in the cloud. Now, I want to focus on desktop a little bit. I breezed over it a little bit in the migration process, but this is something that I want to make sure sticks in your mind here. Where does my desktop go? And there's several ways to accomplish this, depending on what cloud provider you're using. You can create virtual machines where you remote desktop into using an RDP program. You can create virtual workspaces where you can use thin or thick clients to connect to those workspaces. And you can also use technology called AppStream. This is what I have on the screen here. This is an Amazon service that is very similar. If you're used to using a Citrix type environment, this is very similar to that environment where you configure application streaming inside of Amazon Web Services and then only expose the applications through a very thin client, so a web browser per se. This little graphic down here shows that I'm accessing ArcGIS Pro through a web browser. So Pro is actually sitting in the cloud right next to my other infrastructure components there, but I'm accessing it via a thin client, either a thin client that I install on my desktop or a web browser that I can then access Pro and do everything I want to do in Pro just as I would through a desktop or a workspace experience. And what's powerful about creating these virtual environments, either VMs or workspaces or AppStream, is that you build out the desktop to the specifications that you need for that project. So now you don't have to have this one size fits all desktop. Maybe some of you work in 3D space. Maybe some of you do a lot of image processing. Maybe some of you using Pro right now and need that GPU capabilities, or some of you still using ArcMap. Some of you are building out caching. Well, you can have different instances scaled to work according to, I need more RAM or more GPU or more CPU, right? And I can turn those off when I'm not using, turn them on when I need them. Again, only pay for what I use when I use it. A very powerful concept here. Another thing I want to make sure that you consider when moving to the cloud is setting up monitoring. Now, there's going to be a lot of built-in tools that the cloud provide for you automatically. Those cloud providers already have in place, like monitoring your CPU, your RAM, your bandwidth, your storage, all those kinds of things. But they don't monitor these services inside of ArcGIS Server. And that's very important to make sure those are up and running, they're accessible, and your applications don't fail because they can't access that information. And we understand that and recognize that. And we kind of offer three solutions here. We have a very lightweight set of Python scripts that we can deploy out there in the environment to monitor the basics, right? Put everything into one dashboard and even use your operation dashboards to show all those base components like CPU, RAM, memory, storage, things like that, but also connect to ArcGIS Server and monitor the services that are running. Esri offers their ArcGIS Monitor, a very comprehensive a set of tools to monitor the entire enterprise, the database world, the ArcGIS Enterprise world, all of the components there, setting up monitoring and alerting aspects to that. And we also recently have started implementing a third-party tool called PRTG, which gives us the ability to do the same thing, but it comes free for the first 100 sensors. And we're finding that a lot of our base deployments only use about 50 to 60 sensors to monitor everything that they need to monitor. And so a PRTG becomes a good entry point into this process. If you're starting off, on a small scale environment, it becomes a very nice tool. If you want to learn more about that, go to gisinc.com/blog, and you'll see a nice article that was written up on that. Okay, so let's kind of summarize, right? Let's kind of recap everything that we talked about here. First off, don't fear the cloud. The cloud comes with extreme amount of benefits across the board there in its capabilities, right? All these offerings that the cloud offers. And I didn't even talk about I only talk about a small percentage of the things that the clouds offer. Again, we're focusing more on the ArcGIS Enterprise side, just getting ArcGIS Enterprise up there. but there's so many other things that the cloud providers offer, from serverless computing to services like database services, environments, email, text messaging, alerting. There's all kinds of different things that the cloud provides as part of their offering, and you can leverage and take advantage of those as needed. The performance, this is just incredible, right? You can spin up what you need when you need it. We use this a lot internally. When we have a project come in play that may have a lot of data processing needs and large data processing needs, we'll spin up an environment in the cloud. We'll move our data to the cloud, do our processing, which might take hours or days, and then turn it off when we're done. So we didn't have to worry about procuring that hardware internally or provisioning that internally. And when we're done, just having it sit there until the next project comes on, and paying for that internally. The cloud provides that that flexibility for us to gain the performance when we need to, scale up and scale down based on events. Maybe have live in certain parts of the country that require different weather-related events, or maybe during elections or other types of things that come and go, where you provide public access to different services and you need to spin up more to handle the workload for that time period, and then turn them down when you're done. A great example of using the cloud, which goes right into the cost, right? Pay for what you need when you use it, and only when you use it. But you got to be careful. You got to put some governance around this spending capability, because you could spend as much or more in the cloud as you do on premise, right? So you got to be careful how you look at this, architect it out, and how you spin things up and down. It's very easy to take spin up a 64 core, 250 gig RAM, gigabyte RAM machine, and then forget about it and leave it running, right? So you got to be careful about those things. And then security. Hopefully we talked enough about the security that you feel comfortable that these environments are definitely secure and provide that confidence that your information, your data, your applications can be behind this secure environment. Over the years, we've heard folks that have been breached in some form or fashion, even large cloud-based companies. But what's interesting that I found out as I go and I did some of these the research on these, is that in almost every single case, it was human error that caused that breach. Either password weren't secure enough, or a laptop was left on, or data was pushed back and forth between a thumb drive or something like that, or a port was open that shouldn't have been open, or something like that, that exposed the capability of getting into the environment, then to expose whatever information that was after there. So don't fear the cloud. It comes with a lot of capabilities, performance, cost, and security benefits that I think all of us can definitely take advantage of there. So thank you so much for sitting in here. If you have any questions, you can email myself or Wendy, and we can help talk you through this process. We've been through it. We've stubbed our knees early on in the process, and we know some things to avoid and some things to take advantage of.
Yep. So Steve, we have a few questions real quick in the chat. One of the quick ones. So for the PRTG, how is a sensor defined?
So a sensor is defined on anything you want to monitor. So if I have a 4-core box, that would take 4 sensors to monitor. Okay, if I have a chunk of RAM, 256 gigabytes of RAM, that's 1 sensor to monitor that chunk. 2 hard drives, 2 sensors. So you kind of see how that kind of plays out. So in a basic deployment, about 50, 60 sensors it takes to monitor everything, even a handful of services.
So any specific examples of how you helped a client migrate to the cloud? What items remained on-premise versus cloud, and what positive outcomes came about?
So real quick on that one. So sometimes folks are a little apprehensive of taking desktop to the cloud first. So in some cases, a hybrid solution works really well, where you have the web GIS, ArcGIS Enterprise, out in the cloud with either an enterprise geodatabase or file geodatabases that support the publication side. So all the web maps and applications and their web experience. And then desktop is left on premise with the enterprise geodatabase on premise, and then a synchronization process takes place, or some kind of automation to synchronize the data from on premise to the cloud until you find that sweet spot when it's ready to move the cloud or the desktop to the cloud at the same time. And another efficiency that we've seen a lot is a lot of folks use like SQL Server on premise. But going to the cloud, we can take advantage of Postgres. SQL works really nicely in this environment, and Enterprise Data Database works really nicely there, and you can reduce the cost of having that licensing.
Okay, and what is the general cost both in the move and storage?
So that's based on definitely the amount of content and storage that needs to come over. But you can get a basic deployment like that one that I showed you up there with Amazon Web Services for about $300 to $400 a month on the low side to support the 4 basic components, right? Web adapter, portal, server, and the data store. Cost for migrating, it really all depends. And a lot of our clients have a stand up the environment for them, and then they just move content over as they need to and take that opportunity to clean things up, right? Do some spring cleaning before they just move everything over. Take the time to carefully look at what needs to move over, and then do that slowly until you get to that environment ready to go in the cloud.
Yep, so it'll really kind of depend on the size of your architecture, what you're setting up, but both Amazon and Azure have some calculators online where you can go in and select servers and put in the specs, and it can put some cost estimates out for you as well. So you can go and utilize, go just look at your existing environment. But of course, moving to the cloud is a great time to optimize your ArcGIS deployment. And so a lot of our customers are not just taking what they have and putting it in the cloud, but really evaluating and seeing what they really need and how they can gain some efficiencies through that process.
I think one thing I'll add, Wendy, too, is that, as ArcGIS Enterprise evolves, right? We're at 10.8.1 now. 10.9.1 is about to be released this year. ArcGIS Enterprise in itself has become very efficient and very proficient. And some of our clients have one instance running up in the Amazon with all the components running on it because they're a small organization. They don't have thousands of users. They got tens of users, right? And so it can run real nicely on one box and then have another box on standby there in case you're doing patches or upgrades or whatever you want. And so, one box, one 4-core box is on both environments it's pretty cheap. I'm serious. It's about 100, 150 based on how much RAM and cores and storage you put in there. It's not that cost effective or that expensive, and especially the storage. And so to do backups and recoveries, the storage out there is so cheap, right? People can spin up terabytes of storage space in any one of these cloud environments to put their caches, their imagery, those kinds of things out there.
Yep, and some organizations are deploying to that single box method and then breaking it out as needed based on demand.
Yep.
And so, they're with the flexibility of the platform and being able to break out those components on separate servers, or letting their use and demand, really determine when they're doing that. So that's a huge cost savings of not having to do that and have multiple servers up front. Yeah,
and if this is your first time to the cloud, then maybe you stand up one instance, get the things running, and just play with it, play with the environment, test it out, see how it's going to work, how you connect to it, how you share, how you move data across. Do that again, because you can turn it off and turn it on as you need to in this sort of development stage.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that was all the questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you so much.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.